The heat that day didn't just hang in the air. It pressed down, heavy enough to make the street shimmer. I'd been working inside my garage, the kind of quiet Saturday where the world feels half asleep, when a sound tore through that calm like a blade. A scream, high, raw, and wrong. It was the kind of sound that forces every nerve in your body to pay attention. I dropped my wrench, stepped into the doorway, and for a heartbeat, the light outside looked warped, unreal. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. Across the street, chaos had a name, and it was HOA Karen Whitmore. She stood in the middle of the road, clutching a wheelchair, not pushing it, not helping anyone, pulling it. The woman she was yanking it from, Mrs. Jenkins, our quiet 72-year-old neighbor with silver hair and the gentlest voice, was on the ground, arms trembling as she tried to hold on. "Rules are rules," Karen snapped, her words slicing through the humid air. "This is a no-wheel zone." For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. A no-wheel zone? She said it again, louder this time, like she wanted the world to applaud her madness. The neighbors who'd been watering plants or walking dogs froze. A few lifted their phones. Even the cicadas seemed to pause. I felt my pulse tick up. Years of patrol work had taught me that authority, real or fake, always announces itself with confidence before logic catches up. I started walking toward them. My boots hit the driveway hard, steady. Karen's sunglasses caught the sunlight like a signal flare. "Stay back," she barked. "This is HOA business." She said it like she was reading from a badge she didn't have. I kept moving until I could see Mrs. Jenkins's face. The panic there wasn't just fear of falling. It was the shame of being humiliated where she lived. That's when something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to let this play out like another viral tragedy. "Let go of her chair," I said. My voice stayed calm, trained calm, the kind that fills a room even when it's quiet. Karen turned, surprised that someone had interrupted her performance. "Excuse me?" she snapped. "You're talking to your HOA president." I almost laughed. The words felt too absurd to take seriously. "No," I said. "I'm talking to a woman committing assault." A few of the neighbors gasped. Karen's lips curled into a smirk. "You don't understand the rules," she hissed. "Wheels damage the pavement, and this property is public right-of-way," I cut in. "You're 2 feet from a city-maintained road, Karen. You don't own asphalt." That stopped her for a second. She blinked, calculating whether to double down or retreat. Predictably, she doubled down. "This neighborhood agreed," she started. "No," I said. "You wrote the agreement. Big difference." Mrs. Jenkins whimpered softly, reaching for her chair. I stepped closer, hands open, no threat, just presence. "Let it go," I told Karen. The phones were all recording now, half the street catching every breath of the confrontation. Karen's knuckles went white around the handles. She pulled harder, but adrenaline and training beat arrogance every time. I twisted the chair free and steadied Mrs. Jenkins as she tried to sit up. The applause was small at first, a few claps from the porches, nervous, disbelieving. Then more. Karen's face flushed crimson. "You're interfering with HOA enforcement," she screamed. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," I said, "but at least I'll regret it standing up straight." She pointed at me like her finger was a weapon. "You think you can defy community order?" Her voice cracked on the word order, the same way lies always do when they meet real authority. I helped Mrs. Jenkins into her seat, checked her knees, scraped, bleeding, but nothing broken. "You're safe now," I told her. She clutched my hand. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible over Karen's shouting. That was the first time I saw fear flicker behind Karen's sunglasses. Not fear of me, fear of exposure. Because now every phone on that block was pointed at her, and the image of a self-appointed queen tearing a wheelchair from a disabled woman was being carved into digital stone. She realized too late that rules don't protect tyrants when the whole world is watching. I turned to the crowd. Anybody else think no wheels belongs in our bylaws? The quiet laughter that rippled through them wasn't joy. It was relief. The sound of people remembering they didn't have to obey insanity. Karen sputtered something about citations, then stormed off toward her house, heels striking the pavement like gunshots. The air felt heavier after she left, like the street itself was holding its breath. I could still hear Mrs. Jenkins's soft wheeze, still see the smear of rubber where her chair had dragged across the pavement. I'd handled worse scenes in my career, wrecks, arrests, even disasters. But this one lodged under my skin in a different way. Maybe because it wasn't just cruelty. It was organized cruelty, sanctioned by paperwork and ego. Neighbors came over, murmuring, asking if Mrs. Jenkins was okay. One of them whispered, "You shouldn't have done that. She'll come after you." I nodded. Let her. I'd spent too many years chasing people who thought rules were shields. HOA Karen was about to learn the difference between power and authority. That night, I replayed the moment again and again. Her voice, that phrase, "no wheel zone," the way she said it like she was proud. I'd heard criminals justify worse, but never with such suburban polish. I opened my laptop, pulled up the HOA bylaws, and started reading. Page after page of dense language, restricted mobility devices, community aesthetics, authorized enforcement. She'd built her kingdom on loopholes. The next morning, a message pinged in my inbox. Violation notice. Interference with HOA enforcement procedures. Fine, $500. It was signed by Karen herself. I stared at the screen, exhaled slowly, and smiled. She'd just made her first mistake, leaving a paper trail. Out the window, the neighborhood looked the same. Kids on bikes, sprinklers turning, flags fluttering. But something invisible had shifted. People had seen what happened. They were talking now, quietly, cautiously, in driveways and at mailboxes. Power had cracked, just a little. And cracks, once they start, only spread. I leaned back in my chair, let the sun hit the badge still tucked in my desk drawer, the one I hadn't worn since retiring from the force. Old habits die slow. I'd spent years enforcing laws written to protect people from chaos. Now I was looking at a woman who'd built chaos out of laws. That kind of perversion deserved precision. The story the internet would eventually see, the viral clip, the memes, the headlines, all of that started right here, in this quiet second after the scream faded and justice took its first breath. I didn't know it yet, but that video would travel farther than any patrol car ever could, dragging HOA Karen's name through every feed and comment section on the planet. And as for me, I was just getting started. I didn't buy this house for drama. I bought it because the street was quiet, the kind of neighborhood that smelled like cut grass and barbecues. After 15 years in the State Highway Patrol, I'd had enough of flashing lights and midnight chases. I wanted routine, morning coffee, the sound of sprinklers, the comfort of knowing the loudest thing I'd hear was a lawnmower. But peace never lasts where people mistake rules for power. HOA Karen Whitmore had been here long before me, and she treated the neighborhood like her personal jurisdiction. When I first moved in, she brought cookies and a contract. "Just a few small regulations to keep everything beautiful," she'd said. The binder she handed me could have doubled as a weapon. Hundreds of clauses about shrub height, driveway paint, trash can placement. I skimmed it, nodded politely, but I knew the type. Authority addicts always start with smiles. By the next week, The notes began showing up. Small printed reminders about mailbox uniformity, fence color, and community decorum. I tossed them out. She didn't like that. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. By month 2, I'd already seen what she did to anyone who challenged her. She'd fine retirees for keeping garden gnomes, threaten single parents with foreclosure for repeated violations, even call code enforcement when someone dared repaint without her approval. The woman didn't run a homeowners association. She ran a fiefdom. And the board, 5 neighbors too scared to lose their lawns, rubber-stamped every decision she made. I'd dealt with people like her on the job, officers who mistook the badge for permission instead of responsibility. It always ended the same way. One confrontation, one exposure, one fall. Still, I tried to stay out of it. I told myself she was just another busybody burning her time on power trips. That was before she touched Mrs. Jenkins. Mrs. Jenkins had lived here since before the HOA existed, back when the road was gravel and kids still rode bikes without helmets. She'd lost her husband 10 years ago, and the wheelchair was her lifeline. Watching Karen rip it away triggered something that training couldn't suppress. The last time I'd seen a scene like that, it was a drunk driver pulling a victim from a crash site just to shout about insurance. That same hollowness hit me now, the disbelief that anyone could act like that and call it order. After the video went viral, I spent the night combing through the HOA's digital footprint. Years of paperwork were online, all publicly filed. Meeting minutes, expense reports, correspondence. I wasn't looking for vengeance, I was looking for pattern. That's how corruption hides, inside repetition. I printed pages until the ink ran dry. Fines issued for non-approved mobility devices. Expenditures labeled surface protection fees. Every phrase twisted to sound official. Every rule built to disguise exclusion. Karen's power didn't come from law. It came from fear. She enforced compliance through embarrassment. She used neighbors' silence as consent. I recognized that structure. It mirrored the same control tactics I'd studied during internal affairs investigations, psychological policing without accountability. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a cruel policy. It was a system. I called an old colleague at the Department of Public Safety, asked him to check whether any complaints had been filed. He laughed. About your HOA? Half the counties filed complaints. None of them stick. No jurisdiction. That was the problem. HOAs existed in the gray between private and public authority. They could fine you, shame you, ruin your credit, but no one in uniform ever came to stop them. Until now. That call with my old colleague sat with me. No jurisdiction. Those words rang louder than the scream I'd heard that afternoon. I'd spent half my life enforcing laws drawn in black ink, each one traceable to a statute, a signature, a clear chain of accountability. But this was power written in pencil, smudged, local, and completely unmonitored. HOA Karen thrived in that blur. It let her play sheriff without ever wearing the badge. I pulled my own records, checked the property deed, traced the HOA's registration date. They'd formed just after the last housing boom, when developers used associations as leverage for community control. Karen had been there since the beginning, listed as secretary, then treasurer, then president. Every role built on the same pattern. Seize paperwork, centralize decisions, silence dissent. I could almost see her handwriting in the bylaws. Long sentences, unnecessary capital letters, legal jargon stapled to emotion. When you've investigated enough internal corruption cases, you learn to read personality through paperwork. Karen's documents screamed insecurity. Every clause was a mirror. Respect for order, decorum standards, appearance enforcement. They weren't rules, they were armor. She feared disorder the way most people fear storms. The difference is storms pass. Karen didn't. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. I started asking quiet questions around the neighborhood. At first, people gave polite smiles and short answers. Then someone finally cracked. "She fined me for parking my son's wheelchair ramp van too close to the curb," one man said. "Said it violated the aesthetic line of sight." Another whispered about being cited for a temporary fence when her husband deployed overseas. I wrote everything down. Dates, citation numbers, copies of letters. If there was a pattern, it would show up in the data. By the end of the week, I had a stack of complaints thick as a case file. Each story looked small on its own. A petty fine here, a warning there. But together they formed a map of controlled intimidation. Karen wasn't just obsessed with order, she was manufacturing dependence. Every homeowner's silence made her stronger. Every paid fine a brick in her fortress of control. The irony? The woman who claimed to protect property values was the one degrading the neighborhood's dignity. I could see it in people's faces. The forced smiles when she passed. The way conversation stopped mid-sentence if her name came up. Fear in suburbia doesn't shout. It whispers. Still, I didn't want to rush. My instincts from patrol days kicked in. Observe before acting. I needed to understand the structure, the hierarchy, the leverage. So I attended an HOA meeting. Karen stood at the front like a judge, clipboard under one arm, pearls catching the fluorescent light. "We'll begin with compliance updates," she said, and every head lowered slightly. It was theater. She spoke in the same cadence bureaucrats use when they want obedience through boredom. Long pauses, exaggerated emphasis on policy numbers. When one resident asked about the wheelchair incident, Karen brushed it aside. "We're handling that internally." The words internally and handling in the same sentence told me everything I needed to know. I let her finish the meeting, stayed until the room cleared, then walked up to her. "You issued me a violation notice," I said. "Let's discuss it." She smiled, a thin, professional curve that didn't reach her eyes. "Appeals must be filed in writing," she said, turning to leave. "Karen," I said softly, "there's a reason I recognize your tactics. I've seen them before, behind real desks." That stopped her. She turned back, expression flickering. "And what would you know about enforcement?" "Enough," I said, "to tell the difference between it and harassment." For the first time, she didn't have a response. When I walked out of that meeting, the air outside felt heavier than it should have. Streetlights hummed, moths spun in circles around the bulbs, and somewhere behind a half-closed curtain, I could feel eyes following me. That was Karen's real talent. She didn't need to confront everyone directly. She made people police themselves. The next morning, 2 neighbors avoided eye contact when I waved. Fear travels faster than truth in neighborhoods like ours. I poured coffee, sat by the window, and opened the violation letter again. Failure to maintain respectful conduct toward HOA officers. That line told me everything. She'd built her whole power system on ambiguity. Respectful conduct could mean anything she wanted it to mean. That's how unchecked authority always hides. Behind definitions, it can twist. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. I drafted my response carefully, citing the same sections of the HOA charter she'd weaponized. I referenced the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and local property codes. Every line was polite, professional, and lethal. My years of writing reports for prosecutors had taught me that tone can be sharper than any blade if the facts are clean enough. I mailed it certified, then waited. 3 days later, I received an unsigned envelope. No return address, just my name in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Thank you for standing up. She's been doing this for years." No signature. That note said more than any petition could. People were watching. They just needed someone to prove Karen wasn't untouchable. I started piecing together a timeline. The HOA's annual budget didn't match bank transfers. Contractor invoices were padded. Line items for mobility control signage appeared after she'd personally fined residents using wheelchairs or walkers. Every irregularity looked small in isolation, but together they painted the same portrait. Money moving where compassion should have been. By the time dusk settled that night, I had a wall of printouts tacked to my office corkboard, red string tracing every name and transaction. It looked obsessive, maybe even paranoid, but order matters when you're hunting patterns. I'd built cases like this before. Follow the money, follow the motive. Power never exists without profit. Karen's pattern was clear. She used moral language to mask financial self-interest. Beautification fees. Access management costs. Each one funneled money into accounts registered under different shell names. I'd seen the structure before, once during an internal sting involving procurement fraud. Same rhythm, same arrogance. That realization changed everything. This wasn't just about cruelty to Mrs. Jenkins anymore. It was about corruption layered over discrimination. The kind of mix federal agencies like to dismantle publicly. I sent copies of the discrepancies to a friend who worked in the state attorney's office. No details, no context, just documents. "Take a look," I wrote. "You'll know what you're seeing." Within a day, he called back. "You planning to light a fuse?" "Already did," I said. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet again. Kids rode bikes along the same stretch of asphalt Karen claimed to control. Sprinklers clicked in rhythm, the smell of wet grass covering the memory of that scream. Peace had returned, but it wasn't the same kind of peace. It was the silence before a reckoning, the kind that hums like static before a storm. I leaned back in my chair, the glow from the laptop reflecting off the badge still lying beside it. I'd told myself I was done with enforcement, done chasing wrongs that pretended to be right. But watching Karen operate under the flag of community order had reminded me why I'd worn that badge in the first place. Some fights find you again because you never truly finished them. When I closed the laptop, I knew the next step wouldn't be quiet. It would be public, methodical, and final. Karen had built her empire on technicalities. I was going to use those same lines of fine print to dismantle it, one clause, one statute, one signature at a time. By the next week, the story had begun to unfold itself like a blueprint I'd already seen. Every name, every role on the HOA board fit into a pattern too clean to be coincidence. There was always a lieutenant, someone loyal enough to enforce orders without question. There was always a treasurer who never asked where the money went. And there was always one person too afraid to quit. Karen Whitmore had built her hierarchy the same way street gangs build trust, through favors, fear, and silence. When I reviewed the HOA's public filings, her fingerprints were everywhere. She'd rewritten the bylaws 3 times in 6 years. Each revision tucked more power under the president's office. The ability to impose community sanctions, the right to issue emergency fines without board approval, and the authority to interpret conduct violations at her discretion. I'd seen organized units with less centralized control. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. The deeper I looked, the more her empire began to look less like neighborhood governance and more like a small-scale autocracy. Her allies were predictable: real estate agents who wanted property values inflated, contractors who owed her small debts, and one city council aide who attended meetings as a courtesy. I knew that type of courtesy, political insulation. It's what every petty tyrant uses when they start playing bigger than their jurisdiction. I began to see how the no-wheel zone wasn't a slip of arrogance. It was a logical extension of her structure. She'd turned aesthetics into law. If it didn't fit her idea of beauty, it didn't belong. She called it preserving neighborhood integrity. That phrase appeared on 3 flyers and every notice she mailed. It sounded benign, but it carried the weight of exclusion. Behind that smile and clipped tone was the conviction that control was the same as care. When I drove past her house one evening, I noticed the details: perfectly trimmed hedges, matching shutters, flagpole centered to HOA regulation height. Every inch of it screamed compliance. Yet, even from across the street, the place looked hollow, like it had been built to withstand judgment rather than weather. People like Karen need perfection because imperfection reminds them of everything they can't dominate. I interviewed a former board member under the pretense of curiosity. He'd resigned the year before, citing stress. Over coffee, his hands shook when he spoke. "She keeps files on everyone," he said. "Photos, notes, copies of emails, says it's for accountability." He paused, looked down at his cup. "She threatened to sue me when I tried to quit." I asked what kind of threats. He smiled bitterly. "The legal kind. The ones that sound official enough to scare you even if you know they're fake." That's the psychology of a bully wrapped in bureaucracy. Weaponized paperwork. You don't need fists when you've got letterhead. As the days passed, I began to understand the community's silence. Karen had created an atmosphere where resistance looked dangerous and compliance looked safe. She fined one neighbor for leaving a trash bin visible for longer than the community standard. Another for unsanctioned vehicle modification. Translation: new tires. It wasn't about rules. It was about proving she could make you obey them. But systems like hers always overreach. They start needing bigger targets, more dramatic displays to sustain the illusion of power. The wheelchair incident wasn't random. It was escalation. She needed to show everyone that no one, not even the weak, could escape her authority. That realization settled in my stomach like cold iron. It wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was discrimination masquerading as order, and now that discrimination had a paper trail. Karen's power didn't depend on consent. It depended on exhaustion. People learned that it was easier to nod than to argue, cheaper to pay a fine than to fight it. That's how authoritarian systems survive in plain sight. They wear people down until resistance feels like rebellion. And rebellion, in neighborhoods like ours, is just another word for isolation. I'd seen the same method before in municipal politics. A leader creates fear, labels it stability, then convinces the governed that obedience is self-protection. Karen had perfected it. The HOA wasn't her responsibility. It was her stage. And every email, every notice, every threat was a line in the same performance. I am the order here. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. The moment I understood that, I started mapping her influence. The treasurer, Dennis Cole, was a retired accountant who lived 2 houses down. He handled the HOA's improvement funds, which conveniently flowed through a private account before reaching contractors. The vice president, Lorna Tate, had been Karen's friend since college. She ran a landscaping company that somehow won every maintenance bid. Even the local newspaper had published a puff piece about Karen last year, painting her as a community leader committed to neighborhood excellence. The photo showed her standing under a streetlight, hands folded, smile narrow, like authority trying to look compassionate. When I looked closer, I found she'd used HOA funds to pay for that same media outreach. The invoice listed under public image campaign. It wasn't illegal, not technically, but it revealed everything. Karen wasn't serving the community, she was selling it, a curated illusion of order to buyers who didn't know the price of silence. I dug deeper into the city council aide who attended meetings. His name was Mark Daniels. I called a friend who worked in municipal audits, asked what they knew. "He's connected to zoning approvals," my friend said. She probably wants leverage when development permits come up. That clicked. The HOA had denied 2 families permission to build accessibility ramps, claiming design inconsistency. If Karen controlled zoning influence, she could block any project that disrupted her visual order, especially anything that reminded her of imperfection. The next HOA meeting proved it. She opened with an announcement about upcoming community restructuring. Her tone was deliberate, calm, confident. To maintain the neighborhood's reputation, she said, we'll be tightening compliance on mobility devices and exterior modifications. My jaw clenched. She wasn't backing off the no-wheel zone. She was formalizing it. I watched her speak from the back of the room, noting the micro-reactions around her. Some residents nodding nervously, others staring down at their papers, one woman frowning but staying silent. That's how collective control works. It doesn't demand belief, just submission. Karen had turned ordinary people into witnesses who chose quiet over confrontation. When the meeting ended, I approached Dennis, the treasurer. "You ever wonder where the money goes?" I asked. His smile faltered. "What are you implying?" "Nothing," I said. "Just curious how much integrity costs per square foot these days." He didn't respond, but his silence confirmed everything. People inside her circle knew. They just hoped her downfall wouldn't take them with it. That night, I sat on my porch with the HOA handbook open again, page corners curling in the wind. I highlighted one phrase: "The board shall have discretionary power in all matters of conduct, aesthetics, and compliance." Discretionary power, the legal synonym for unlimited control. She'd written her own absolution into the rules. I'd seen organized crime disguise itself as community outreach. This was the suburban version: clean lawns, quiet streets, and tyranny behind the hedges. And the thing about tyrannies, large or small, is that they always forget one rule. Every empire looks permanent until the paperwork turns against it. The more I read, the clearer her design became. Karen's discretionary power clause wasn't just an accident of language. It was a firewall. She'd written herself immunity into the system. Any challenge could be dismissed as interpretive error. That's how she stayed untouchable. Not by hiding in shadows, but by standing in the open, covered by paperwork that looked legitimate to anyone who didn't read past the first paragraph. Still, power that brittle always starts to crack at the edges. The first fracture came from inside. Late one evening, I found a brown envelope wedged between my storm door and the frame. No note, just photocopies, financial ledgers, minutes from closed board sessions, and a list of residents labeled observation priority. Next to each name, handwritten notes, non-compliant, track curb photos. At the bottom of the list was Mrs. Jenkins. The handwriting was Karen's. "Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now." That file changed everything. She wasn't just enforcing order, she was profiling her neighbors. I sat at my kitchen table, spreading the pages out beneath the lamp. Every highlight glowed like evidence waiting for daylight. There were references to approved property takeovers, legal language hinting at forced lien sales. She'd used citations to pressure families into selling, then flipped their houses through a developer she quietly partnered with. The HOA wasn't her throne. It was her business model. The next day I walked the neighborhood with a notebook, marking properties listed in those documents. 6 had been sold in the past year, all under foreclosure due to unpaid fines. Each had gone to the same developer. On paper, everything looked procedural. In practice, it was extortion with a smile. I called one former resident whose number still appeared on a utility record. "Yeah," he said, voice low. "She bled us until we left. Said she could take the house if we didn't pay." He laughed without humor. "Funny thing, 2 weeks after we moved, it was listed at triple the price." He hung up before I could reply. That night, I watched Karen drive past my house twice, her headlights slowing at the mailbox. I didn't move. Let her look. Let her wonder how much I knew. People like her crumble not when you confront them, but when they realize someone's documenting every move. Inside, I pinned the new evidence beside the old. The wall looked less like a collection now and more like a map of motive. Names connected to dates, signatures looping into the same two initials. KW. She'd hidden greed beneath neighborhood pride. That made her predictable, and predictability is the first step toward dismantling control. The final piece came when I traced her email correspondence with the city aide, Mark Daniels. In one message, she wrote, "Need zoning assurance before next acquisition. Residents must appear supportive." It was time-stamped 2 days before the wheelchair incident. That line told me she'd planned a confrontation, something public enough to remind everyone who ruled this street. She wanted fear back in circulation. She wanted obedience to feel inevitable. But fear works both ways. When someone like Karen senses exposure, paranoia replaces confidence. I knew it was coming. The mistakes, the overreactions, the public unraveling. She'd start lashing out, tightening control, sending more violation letters, holding emergency meetings. That's how you catch dictatorships in miniature. They collapse under their own paperwork. By the end of that week, I'd gathered enough for a formal complaint, but I wasn't ready to submit it yet. Not until the pattern became undeniable. Power has a habit of digging its own grave if you give it time and attention. I poured another cup of coffee, stared at the evidence wall, and smiled faintly. The groundwork was finished. The next phase wouldn't be about watching. It would be about revealing. I didn't sleep much that week. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that list again. Observation priority. Names of people who'd done nothing more than live on the wrong side of Karen Whitmore's sense of control. By Friday morning, I'd turned my living room into an operations base. Folders stacked in precise rows, photocopies sorted by category. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was building a case. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. I started by cross-checking Karen's financial filings with public property records. The inconsistencies jumped out fast. Payments labeled community improvement expenses led to companies that didn't exist. One listed address turned out to be a P.O. box 2 towns over, registered under a dissolved LLC. I'd worked fraud cases before. This wasn't sloppiness. It was structure. She'd built an invisible network that moved money in perfect circles until no one could tell where it began or ended. The city database showed something even stranger. Her HOA had filed 3 liens in the last quarter alone. 2 of them were for non-compliant exterior fixtures. That's legal shorthand for nothing. But each lien ended with a property transfer. Every home went to a developer connected to the same realtor, Tate and Associates, Lorna Tate, Karen's vice president and lifelong friend. The line between neighbor and accomplice blurred entirely. I needed official verification, so I reached out to an old contact at the county clerk's office, someone who still owed me a favor from a narcotics audit years back. I kept it simple. Check the transfer trail on these parcel numbers. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed. The message read, "Same signature on every closing doc, K. Whitmore. You didn't hear it from me." My pulse kicked once, slow and heavy. There it was. Direct evidence of forgery under the shield of authority. Still, I needed leverage, not just proof. Bureaucracies move slow. Power crumbles faster when exposed to public light. I filed an anonymous inquiry with the state's Division of Consumer Affairs, attaching copies of the suspicious financials and one of the altered minutes documents. Under ordinary conditions, that kind of report would take weeks to process, but I worded it carefully, flagged it under potential ADA violation. Those 3 letters, ADA, get attention faster than anything else when accessibility is involved. By evening, I received a call back. The agent's tone was professional but sharp. "We've seen your submission," she said. "Is this related to the wheelchair incident circulating online?" I kept my answer neutral. "Possibly. You'll have to determine that yourself." She didn't laugh. "If these documents are real, this isn't just civil, it's criminal. We'll forward this to our legal division for preliminary assessment." I hung up, sat back, and exhaled through my teeth. It had begun. The next move was local. Every HOA must file annual budget reports with the city, available to residents on request. Karen had always delayed releasing them, claiming data consolidation. But she couldn't deny a direct legal demand. I drafted a request under the Homeowner Transparency Act and hand-delivered it to the HOA office. Her house. When she opened the door, she smiled like a politician caught mid-lie. "Is there something you need, dear?" "Just the annual reports," I said evenly. "Statute 14B requires you to provide them within 7 days." Her smile twitched. "I wasn't aware you were quoting statutes now." "I like to stay informed," I said, handing her the form. "Knowledge keeps the peace." Her eyes flicked to the paper, then back to me. For a split second, the mask slipped. Fear. Not panic. Strategic fear. The kind people get when they realize the game board's been flipped. That night, my email pinged. No message, just a single PDF attachment titled Budget FY 2022. I opened it carefully. Page 1 looked standard: operating costs, reserve funds, projected maintenance. But page 2, miscellaneous, disbursements, was chaos. Payments with no vendor numbers, no receipts, no tax IDs, $12,250 labeled community enhancement, $8,900 marked enforcement expenses, and a final transfer, $33,000, to Tate and Associates Infrastructure Consulting. It was money laundering disguised as lawn care. I printed every page twice, sealed one copy in a manila envelope, and locked it in a safety box. The other stayed on my desk under a sticky note. Next move, find the federal hook. Because local corruption can hide for years, but federal jurisdiction changes the rules. If she touched even a single dollar tied to a federally backed loan or disability accommodation, she'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The next 72 hours turned the investigation from quiet suspicion into open pursuit. The Consumer Affairs Division reached back with a single message, forwarded to DOJ ADA Compliance Office. That was the first confirmation I wasn't fighting alone. When the federal government takes even a whisper of interest, the air around corruption changes. People start hearing footsteps they can't see. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. I began coordinating quietly with 2 contacts, a paralegal from my academy days and a retired postal inspector who specialized in white-collar cases. The paralegal traced the LLC paperwork for Tate and Associates and found that the company's renewal license had lapsed 6 months before the last contract. In other words, every payment after that date was an illegal transaction. The postal inspector looked at the mailing patterns from the HOA's P.O. box. 90% of the envelopes went to the same address in Dallas, an address registered to an interstate property brokerage. It wasn't neighborhood management. It was real estate flipping disguised as civic service. By Tuesday, the pressure had started to show. Grace Karen Whitmore, our self-anointed enforcer, held an emergency HOA meeting. The email notice went out at 5:43 a.m., titled Immediate Policy Reinforcement. She called it to discuss security breaches and misinformation. I attended, sitting near the back again. Her eyes scanned the room like a border guard. "Someone," she said, "has been leaking sensitive financial documents to outside entities." Her voice didn't shake, but her knuckles whitened around the microphone. The irony was perfect. She was calling transparency treason. When she finished her speech, she opened the floor to questions. I raised my hand. "Since you mentioned transparency," I said, "can you clarify why Tate & Associates was paid $33,000 for infrastructure consulting when their license was suspended?" The room froze. Her eyes locked on mine. "That's not accurate," she said evenly. "Those payments were authorized maintenance reimbursements." I nodded. "So you'll have no issue sharing the receipts for those reimbursements?" Murmur rippled across the room. That's when she slipped. "The receipts are under legal review," she said. "We're not required to release them during an active investigation." "An active investigation?" I asked, letting the words hang. "Who's investigating, Karen?" She didn't answer. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was diagnostic. Every authoritarian loses power the same way, one unguarded sentence at a time. After the meeting, I walked straight to my car, knowing she'd follow. She did. Her heels clicked across the pavement like a metronome. "You think this makes you clever?" she said. "You have no idea how this works." "Actually," I said, unlocking my door, "I think I'm starting to." That night, I compiled a timeline. Every transaction, every meeting, every recorded incident of harassment. The document stretched 12 pages, cross-referenced by dates, witnesses, and statute numbers. The ADA clauses sat in bold. I sent it to the federal compliance contact with a short message, "Request confirmation of receipt." The reply came 12 minutes later. "Received. Under preliminary evaluation. You'll be contacted by regional investigators. When federal evaluation begins, silence follows. No more phone calls. No more early morning visits." Karen didn't know it yet, but the quiet she was enjoying was the calm before jurisdiction. 2 days later, I found a letter slipped under my door. No HOA letterhead this time, just plain paper. The handwriting was aggressive, pressed hard enough to indent the page beneath. "You're destroying this neighborhood. Back off before you regret it." I photographed it, logged the timestamp, then placed the original in a plastic sleeve. Retaliation under active complaint equals obstruction. It was exactly the behavior I'd predicted. Panic wearing a mask of control. By the weekend, I noticed the first federal vehicle, a plain gray sedan parked near the subdivision entrance, government plates, tinted glass. They didn't come to talk. They came to observe. That's how real oversight begins, silently. Meanwhile, I kept feeding the machine. Every transaction, every fake fine, every recorded threat went into a shared drive labeled Evidence 001. I wasn't gathering data anymore. I was documenting history in real time. By Monday morning, the silence broke. A black SUV rolled past the neighborhood gate. Not one of Karen's decoys this time, but the kind with discrete antenna clusters and government-issue tires. 2 agents stepped out in plain clothes, wearing that posture you only see in people who don't need to explain who they are. They walked straight to Karen's house. No drama, no lights. Real authority doesn't announce itself. It just arrives. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. Through my window, I watched her open the door, arms crossed, voice sharp. But the agents didn't flinch. They entered calmly. One, carrying a briefcase, the other a manila folder. For 20 minutes, nothing moved. Then Karen stepped outside, pale and furious, a copy of the subpoena clutched in her hand. That was the moment everything flipped. The same neighbors who once whispered, "Don't mess with her," were now standing in their driveways, watching her unravel. The myth of invincibility had cracked, and once it cracks, it never reseals. I got my own call an hour later. "This is Agent Norris, Department of Justice, ADA compliance," the voice said. We'd like to verify the authenticity of your evidence submissions." His tone was calm but deliberate. Each word weighed. "We may also need a formal statement regarding the online incident involving a mobility aid." I agreed, met them at the district office downtown. They didn't waste time. The folder on the table contained copies of Karen's forged signatures, her internal correspondence with Lorna Tate, and photos of the observation priority lists. "These were recovered from a hard drive during a preliminary inspection," Norris said. "We're cross-referencing with your submissions." Another agent, Ramirez, looked up. "You realize what this implies? Fraud, ADA interference, male misrepresentation, each carries its own statute." I nodded. "And together?" "Together," he said, "they form a pattern of systemic abuse under color of authority." Hearing it framed in legal language felt surreal. Everything I'd documented in living rooms and late nights now had a federal label. The weight shifted. It wasn't one neighbor against a tyrant anymore. It was the law against impersonation of law itself. When I returned home that evening, a different kind of tension filled the street. No one greeted me, but I could feel their eyes. People weren't sure if I was the hero or the reason the spotlight had come. That's how power transitions always feel at first: uneasy, uncertain, half afraid to believe it's real. Karen's house stayed dark for 2 nights. Curtains drawn, porch light off. Then, on the 3rd morning, a moving truck arrived. Not for furniture, but for records. Box after box labeled HOA archives was carried out by city clerks. She stood in the driveway, forced smile plastered on her face, pretending to supervise. But her hands trembled. Later that afternoon, I received confirmation. The HOA's accounts were frozen pending investigation. Federal oversight had officially been declared. Every transaction, every fee, every lien would be audited from the ground up. I walked the neighborhood at sunset, the air finally still. For the first time in months, no one looked over their shoulder. The fear had shifted sides. Karen's empire, her false kingdom of fines and intimidation, was crumbling quietly, without theatrics, just paperwork, signatures, and silence. That's the beauty of real accountability. It doesn't shout, it erases. Inside my house, I took one last look at the evidence wall. I didn't feel triumph, not yet. That comes later, when the verdict is written. What I felt was clarity, a calm certainty that the storm was now in capable hands. I took the files down one by one, stacking them neatly on the table, and whispered, "Your move, Karen." When corruption is cornered, it doesn't surrender. It performs. Karen Whitmore's performance began 2 days after the subpoena. The HOA bulletin board outside her house, once filled with meeting reminders and garden tips, now displayed a typed manifesto titled "Protecting Our Community from External Sabotage." She framed herself as the victim, the misunderstood defender of neighborhood purity. It was equal parts desperation and theater. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. She called another emergency meeting, this time in the community hall, not her living room. The space filled fast. Neighbors came not for allegiance, but curiosity. The air was heavy with that peculiar quiet that always precedes a reckoning. Karen stood at the front, posture perfect, face painted with strained confidence. "I know you've heard rumors," she began, "but let me be clear. These so-called investigations are politically motivated. They're attacks on our freedom to self-govern." Her voice was steady, rehearsed, but her hands betrayed her, small tremors each time she gripped the podium. She spoke of loyalty, of outsiders, of how certain residents were working against community unity. Her eyes found me in the crowd. "We must root out those who spread lies," she said, "before they destroy what we've built." It was an attempt to rally the fearful, the ones who valued comfort over truth. But truth has its own rhythm, slow, steady, unstoppable. I waited until she opened the floor for discussion. "Madam President," I said, standing, "you claim you're protecting this community. Could you clarify how forging financial documents and violating the ADA fits into that protection?" A ripple of shock cut through the room. She froze, lips parting slightly. For a heartbeat, silence ruled. Then she laughed, a sound too high and too thin. "More conspiracy theories," she said. "I see the internet's made an expert of you." I didn't smile. "No, ma'am. The Department of Justice did." Gasps, a few whispers. One man dropped his coffee cup. She tried to regain footing, but the floor was already gone beneath her. "You're lying," she snapped. "There's no federal involvement." "I have a case number," I said quietly. "Would you like it read aloud?" The room fractured, half disbelief, half relief. People who'd stayed silent for months began murmuring. The illusion of her control was dissolving live in front of them. After the meeting, I expected her to retreat. She didn't. She fought. That night, anonymous flyers appeared on every doorstep. "Beware of false informants. Some residents seek to destroy your property values, each one signed with the HOA logo." Fear had always been her weapon. Now it was all she had left. But fear is fragile when truth is public. The next morning, a local journalist showed up at my door. She introduced herself as Dana Caldwell from Channel 8 Investigates. "We've been following the ADA case," she said. "We'd like your side before we air the segment." I hesitated. Speaking on record meant exposure. But silence, I realized, would only let her rewrite the story again. We sat on my porch for 20 minutes, the recorder clicking softly. I told her everything. The confrontation, the documents, the federal investigation. When I finished, Dana closed her notebook and said, "We'll run it clean. No spin." The story aired that evening under the headline, "HOA President Accused of Fraud and ADA Violation. Federal Inquiry Underway." The footage cut between my statement and clips of the original wheelchair incident, neighbors' recordings, Karen's shouting, the fall, the disbelief. Within hours, it was everywhere. Local news led to regional syndication. Regional went national. Online forums tore her apart. By midnight, the neighborhood looked different. Curtains glowed blue from television screens. Phones rang in living rooms that hadn't been heard from reporters in years. And for the first time, people weren't afraid to speak Karen's name out loud. She tried to fight back on social media, posting long defenses about context and misinformation. But context doesn't erase footage. Misinformation doesn't survive documentation. Every comment she made was met with screenshots, evidence, timestamps. The internet had found its new villain, and this time, it wasn't letting go. By sunrise, the street was unrecognizable. Satellite vans lined the curb, reporters setting up tripods where kids used to ride bikes. For years, Karen Whitmore had controlled this neighborhood with newsletters and fines. Now, her name was trending nationwide. Every network replayed the same clip, her voice shouting, "No wheels allowed!" followed by the sound of tires screeching against pavement. You could almost feel the weight of that sentence collapsing her empire in real time. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. That morning, she tried damage control. The HOA Facebook page, once filled with bake sale announcements and gardening contests, became her battleground. "The footage was edited," she wrote. "The resident involved had been warned multiple times for disruptive behavior. But the internet has no patience for revisionist history. Within minutes, commenters posted timestamps, legal citations, and side-by-side clips." The narrative slipped from her hands like sand through an open fist. By noon, a convoy of vehicles rolled into the subdivision. Local law enforcement, federal ADA compliance, officers, and 2 city inspectors. They weren't there to make a scene. They were there to make copies. Every document, every record, every email stored on HOA servers was boxed, sealed, and logged into evidence. Karen tried to intercept, waving her arms in protest, but the lead investigator raised a badge and said, "Ma'am, interfering with a federal order is a felony." The cameras caught everything. I watched from across the street as she stood frozen on her porch, lips trembling, eyes darting between the agents and the reporters. The woman who once fined neighbors for leaving trash cans out too long now couldn't move her own without clearance. Her power, once absolute, had been reduced to silence under the weight of federal procedure. That night, she called an emergency board meeting via Zoom, her last attempt to maintain authority. Only 3 members joined. The rest had resigned publicly on social media. I listened quietly as she tried to sound composed. "We need to rebuild trust," she said. "Show the media this was a misunderstanding." But halfway through, a notification pinged. Account access revoked, pending investigation. The federal auditors had shut her out of the system mid-sentence. She froze, blinking at the screen, microphone still live. One of the remaining board members sighed. "It's over, Karen," he said. "Let it go." Then he disconnected. The next morning, the inevitable arrived. The official indictment. Fraud, falsification of financial records, ADA interference, and obstruction of justice. Each charge delivered with the calm authority of printed truth. She was taken from her home quietly, escorted without handcuffs, but the cameras caught the moment anyway. The stiff walk, the hollow stare, the faint shake of denial. Neighbors gathered at their windows, some whispering prayers, others just watching the end of an era. Mrs. Jenkins, the woman whose wheelchair had started it all, sat on her porch in the morning sun, hands folded in her lap. She didn't smile. She just watched with the calm of someone who'd already known how it would end. When the news broke, the reaction was immediate. Emails flooded city offices, homeowners from across the country sending in similar stories, old files, copies of no-wheel letters. It turned out Karen's HOA was not unique, just the first to be caught. The DOJ announced a regional task force within days. A movement had started from one act of cruelty recorded on a cell phone. But even as the system turned, Karen tried one last move. She filed a counterclaim, accusing the neighborhood of defamation and harassment. It was her final illusion of control, a way to pretend she still held the gavel. The court dismissed it in less than an hour. That evening, the same reporter, Dana Caldwell, returned. "You realize this has gone national, right?" she asked, stepping onto my porch again. "You've got senators referencing this case in accessibility reform hearings." I shook my head slowly. "I didn't set out to make history," I said, "just to stop one person from thinking she was the law." Dana smiled. "That's usually how real change starts." The air was still when she left, but lighter somehow, like the neighborhood itself had finally exhaled. The courtroom smelled faintly of paper and fear. Rows of benches filled with reporters, neighbors, and a few strangers who had come just to see the woman behind the headlines. Karen Whitmore sat at the defense table, her posture perfect, but her eyes hollow. The same sunglasses that once hid her arrogance now hung uselessly from a trembling hand. Her attorney whispered, gesturing toward a pile of documents stacked higher than her confidence. She nodded absently, like she already knew how the script would end. "Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now." When the judge entered, the room went still. He wasn't there for theater. He was there for balance, the kind Karen had never believed in. The prosecutor began methodically, reading each charge like a slow dismantling of her empire. Fraud, obstruction, ADA interference, abuse of power under false authority. With every word, her shoulders lowered another inch, the sound of her downfall echoing against marble walls. Then came the evidence, copies of the altered budgets, witness testimonies, the letter she'd written threatening non-compliant residents. Each document projected on a screen, undeniable and unspun. When the video of her yanking Mrs. Jenkins's wheelchair played, a collective murmur rippled through the gallery. The moment that had begun as a neighborhood scandal now stood as national proof of what unchecked control looks like when filmed in daylight. Karen tried to speak when it was her turn, said she was misunderstood, claimed she was maintaining community standards. The judge didn't raise his voice, but his tone silenced her completely. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "there is no community where cruelty is a standard." The verdict didn't take long. Guilty on all counts. The fine was heavy, the sentence suspended with conditions, restitution, community service, mandatory ethics rehabilitation. But it wasn't the legal weight that broke her. It was the applause that followed. Not mocking, not loud, just a quiet, collective release. People clapped because something poisonous had finally been named for what it was. Outside, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions she couldn't answer. I stood near the courthouse steps, watching the scene unfold. Mrs. Jenkins waited nearby, calm in her wheelchair, sunlight glinting off the chrome handles. She turned her head toward me and smiled, small but steady. That smile said everything. It was over. For weeks, the news cycle ran her name daily. HOA boards across the country held emergency meetings, rewriting bylaws, auditing accounts, fearing exposure. What had started as one neighborhood incident had grown into a national reckoning. Hashtags flooded social media. No Wheel Zone. Accountability Act. Justice for Jenkins. Legislators began drafting amendments to clarify HOA authority boundaries. Change was slow, but it had begun, not because of outrage alone, but because a single line in a single video had exposed a flaw in the system. Power without empathy always ends in ruin. At home, the neighborhood began to heal. The lawns grew wilder for a while, people learning that freedom looks different from control. The HOA was dissolved under state supervision. A community council replaced it. No titles, no fines, no fake laws, just neighbors deciding together how to live decently again. One evening, I saw a moving truck in front of Karen's house. No press, no farewell. Just her, quietly closing the door on the empire she'd built on intimidation. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The next day, I found a small note slipped into my mailbox. The handwriting was shaky, unfamiliar. "Thank you for standing when the rest of us couldn't. J." No return address, no signature beyond that single letter. I folded it carefully, placed it in the same file that once held every document from the case. That file had started as evidence. It ended as proof of something far greater, that decency, when defended, still wins. Justice, once set in motion, doesn't stop at a single verdict. It spreads. After the court ruling, the federal oversight team didn't disband. They expanded. The DOJ opened a new file titled Operation Evergreen, an audit initiative targeting HOAs across 5 states. Karen Whitmore's case became its blueprint, a training module for identifying abuse disguised as governance. Every document I'd helped compile was now part of that model. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. A month after sentencing, I was contacted by an investigator named Jordan Ellis. He wasn't interested in sympathy. He was interested in systems. "We're finding patterns," he said. Other associations using identical financial templates. Same language, same shell LLCs, even the same vendors. His tone was measured, but there was something sharper beneath it, quiet disgust. You didn't just stop one HOA, he said. You exposed a network. The discovery hit harder than any headline. What started as one act of cruelty on a quiet street was part of a coordinated machine, a network of pseudo-legal organizations profiting off fear, disability, and bureaucracy. Karen wasn't the architect, just one cog that finally jammed. The difference was that this time, the machine had left fingerprints. Within weeks, subpoenas went out across the state. County clerks combed through decades of property transfers. Financial investigators mapped every payment trail tied to Tate & Associates and its parent companies. The results were staggering. Millions in misappropriated funds disguised as community projects, siphoned from homeowners who never realized they were paying into a private empire. Meanwhile, the local news wouldn't let it fade. Dana Caldwell ran a 3-part special titled The HOA Empire, Power, Money, and the Price of Silence. The final segment featured interviews with victims from neighboring towns, each story echoing the same pattern: fines without cause, threats disguised as notices, and a smiling board president repeating Karen's favorite line, "Rules are rules." The public outrage that followed forced state legislators to hold hearings on HOA reform. Inside those hearings, the atmosphere was electric. Veterans, seniors, and disabled residents testified under oath, their voices steady, their stories precise. "We were told to be quiet," one man said, "that we didn't understand the rules, but all we wanted was dignity." Cameras captured every word. No theatrics. Just truth made visible. By summer, a new bill had reached the governor's desk, the Community Oversight and Transparency Act. It mandated full public audits for any homeowners association exceeding 50 members and required independent review of all ADA-related enforcement actions. For the first time in state history, the law recognized that small power can do great harm if left unchecked. I received a letter of acknowledgement from the DOJ's regional director. It was formal, written in plain government language, but the final line carried weight. Your actions contributed to measurable legal reform and the protection of vulnerable citizens. You have our respect. I folded it and placed it beside the note Mrs. Jenkins had written. One born from gratitude, the other from justice. Together, they told the story better than any headline could. Still, not everyone was ready to move on. Karen's supporters, the ones who'd built their identities around her control, tried to rewrite history. They claimed she'd been targeted unfairly, that the media exaggerated, that outsiders had ruined a good neighborhood. But reality doesn't yield to nostalgia. The HOA no longer existed. Its accounts were liquidated, properties restored, debts forgiven. And for those who still refused to see the truth, silence became their only refuge. That's the thing about accountability. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, but it never leaves. 6 weeks after the verdict, the sound of silence had changed. It wasn't fearful anymore. It was restorative. Neighbors began talking again, not about fines or bylaws, but about paint colors, repairs, and small plans for a summer fair. For the first time in years, people looked each other in the eye without scanning for authority figures behind them. It wasn't peace born from ignorance. It was peace earned through exposure. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. Federal updates arrived in steady waves. The DOJ confirmed that over a dozen additional HOA boards across the region were under audit. Investigators were uncovering the same patterns: phantom companies, inflated invoices, weaponized rules. The news didn't shock me anymore. Once you've seen how easily power imitates legitimacy, every seal and signature starts to look suspicious. But this time, The system was paying attention. Dana Caldwell's final report aired one quiet Thursday night. It wasn't sensational, just facts layered over still images of empty HOA offices and seized records. Her narration was calm. For years, homeowners feared the people who were supposed to protect them. Today, those same systems answer to the law. Her last line lingered. Sometimes justice isn't loud, it's methodical. The impact rippled far beyond the cameras. Congress members cited Operation Evergreen in federal oversight hearings. Civil rights organizations referenced it as a modern case study in micro-authoritarianism. The wheelchair incident that once seemed local now appeared in academic papers and training courses. What had started as one woman's cruelty became a national mirror, forcing a country to confront the arrogance of small power and the quiet endurance of those it crushes. Meanwhile, Karen's name faded from headlines, replaced by reform. Her restitution payments funded accessibility improvements across public spaces, ramps, curbs, crosswalks, and signage. Each one carried a small bronze plaque reading, "Funded through Ada Restitution, 2025. It wasn't revenge. It was irony turned into purpose. I visited Mrs. Jenkins one afternoon in late spring. The sun was sharp, the air full of that clean, post-storm stillness. She was tending to a small garden beside her porch, wearing a straw hat and a smile that looked unburdened. "Feels like the neighborhood's breathing again," she said. I nodded, watching bees move lazily between the flowers. "It's strange," I told her. "You think winning means you stop fighting, but sometimes it just means you start healing." She chuckled softly. "Maybe both," she said. Her wheelchair gleamed in the sunlight. New, modern, donated by a veterans accessibility fund. It rolled smooth over the porch wood, the sound almost melodic. Watching her move freely again felt more powerful than any courtroom verdict. Because that was the point all along. Not punishment, but restoration. Back home, I found an email from Agent Norris. Final phase of Operation Evergreen concluded. Whitmore and Tate banned from administrative positions for life. All victims' fines refunded. Case officially closed. There was nothing poetic in his words, just certainty, the language of finality. I read it twice, then closed the laptop. That night, I stood outside on my porch, the same one where the first scream had echoed months ago. The streetlights glowed steady now. No flashing, lights, no cameras, no shouting. Just quiet. I realized I didn't need recognition, or gratitude, or even closure. What mattered was that the system had listened, that somewhere, someone in a different town would see what happened here and decide not to stay silent. Because that's how corruption truly dies, not from punishment, but from awareness. Once seen, it can't hide again. The weeks that followed felt different, like the air itself had shed something heavy. People smiled again at mailboxes. Kids played in the cul-de-sac without their parents glancing nervously toward Karen's old house. The fear that once lived in the silence between door slams and HOA notices had been replaced with something unfamiliar. Trust. The kind that doesn't arrive with fanfare. It just grows back slowly, like grass after a burn. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. The county finally repossessed the HOA office, turning it into a community center. They left the front sign untouched, Maple Ridge Association, but etched a new phrase underneath, "By the people, for the people." I walked through those doors one evening during the reopening. The place smelled of new paint and possibility. Where Karen once held meetings filled with threats and citations, now kids' drawings lined the walls. A bulletin board listed upcoming events. Neighborhood cleanup, free yoga, community BBQ. No bylaws, no fines, just connection. Inside the main hall, a small plaque caught my attention. in honor of every neighbor who refused to look away. My throat tightened a little when I read it. There was no name, no signature, just the message. That anonymity felt right, because what happened here was never about a single hero or villain. It was about the line between control and community, and what happens when ordinary people finally stop confusing silence with peace. One by one, the neighbors who'd once been afraid of speaking up began telling their stories. Some apologized. Some thanked me. Others just stood beside me quietly, sharing that unspoken relief that comes after surviving something together. No one mentioned Karen by name anymore. That was its own kind of justice. She was no longer the reference point for fear, just a footnote in the record of how not to lead. Later that night, I drove to the edge of the subdivision where the first confrontation had taken place, the spot where the asphalt still bore faint scuffs from Mrs. Jenkins's wheelchair tires. I parked, stepped out, and stood in the quiet hum of cicadas and streetlights. It was the same road, but it didn't feel the same. Not because it had changed, because we had. The moonlight caught a shimmer off the new ADA-compliant crosswalk sign, freshly installed. Small detail, big statement. That's what reform looks like, not in speeches but in fixtures, codes, and choices that outlast outrage. As I turned to leave, a car slowed beside me. Mrs. Jenkins leaned out the window, her voice soft but strong. "You did good," she said. "We did good." I smiled. "Guess we finally made this street safe for everyone." She nodded. "No more no-wheel zones," she said with a faint grin before driving off into the quiet. I stood there a while longer, listening to the sound of her tires fade into the distance. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't the echo of conflict. It was the rhythm of a neighborhood finally free. And in that silence, I realized something profound. Justice isn't about punishment or spectacle. It's about balance restored, about ordinary people standing firm until the noise dies and the truth remains. That night, I went home, turned off every light, and slept deeper than I had in months. No more patrols, no more whispers, just stillness, the kind that feels earned. Morning light crept through the blinds like it had something new to say. The kind of light that doesn't wake you. It forgives you. For the first time in months, I didn't wake up expecting another email, another headline, another fight. The case was done. The laws were changing. The neighborhood had healed. But still, part of me kept listening for echoes. Because when you've lived through chaos long enough, silence feels suspicious. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. I brewed coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The air had that crisp stillness only autumn can bring. Clean, honest, final. Across the street, Mrs. Jenkins was sitting in her garden again, her wheelchair beside a bed of sunflowers taller than she was. She waved. I raised my cup in return. It struck me then how something as small as a wave could feel revolutionary when you remember what it cost to earn. The world had moved on from our story, but the ripples never stopped. The DOJ's reforms expanded nationwide. New language was written into federal housing policy, prohibiting discriminatory enforcement and requiring transparent HOA audits. The press had given it a name: the Jenkins Clause. It became shorthand for accountability. Every law student, every board president, every small-town bureaucrat now knew what it meant when they heard it. I didn't ask for that kind of recognition, but I understood its value. Change, when written into law, becomes memory that doesn't fade. I kept a box of reminders under my desk: the original printed emails, the news clippings, the DOJ letter, and the note from Mrs. Jenkins. Not as trophies, but as anchors. Proof that truth, no matter how small, leaves fingerprints. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a regional housing symposium in D.C. Citizens and Accountability in Modern Communities. I didn't want to go. I wasn't a politician or a scholar. I was just the guy who couldn't stand watching someone get her dignity stolen on her own street. But when I stepped onto that stage, the room fell silent in a way I recognized, not anticipation, but respect. I told them what happened, not the viral version, not the headlines, the truth. The heat of the pavement that day, the sound of a scream cutting through ordinary life, the absurdity of hearing someone justify cruelty as enforcement. And then, the part no one talks about, the loneliness that comes after doing the right thing. Because courage looks noble in hindsight, but in real time, it just feels heavy. When I finished, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then someone stood. Applause began. Slow, deliberate, honest. I nodded, humbled, because applause doesn't fix the world. It just means people heard you. After the symposium, a man approached me, older, wearing a veteran's pin on his lapel. "You reminded me why we fought," he said simply, "because power without accountability is just another uniform." His words stuck. They still do. That night, back home, I sat on the porch again beneath a sky washed clean by rain. The air smelled of cedar and wet asphalt. For the first time, the street looked exactly how it should. Unremarkable, ordinary, alive. Porch lights glowed like steady little beacons of calm, and the hum of crickets filled the pauses where tension used to live. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. Across the way, a young couple pushed a stroller down the sidewalk. Their laughter floated through the dark, unbothered, free. It hit me that this was the truest measure of victory. Not headlines or legislation, but the ability to live without fear. To move without asking permission. To exist without the weight of someone else's control pressing against you. Karen Whitmore had vanished from the map. No interviews, no updates, no defiance left to give. The HOA she ruled was now just paperwork in a federal archive. But her downfall had become more than punishment. It was precedent. Her name would be remembered not out of hatred but as a warning, a reminder that power without conscience always ends the same way. Alone, irrelevant, forgotten. A few weeks later, I received a small envelope in the mail. No return address, just a single card inside. On it, a quote printed in quiet type. "The opposite of authority is not chaos, it's compassion." There was no signature, but I knew who it was from. I placed it in the box with the rest. The badge photo, the first HOA notice, the court transcript. The box was heavy, but the weight no longer felt like burden. It felt like proof. That evening, Mrs. Jenkins came by for coffee. She wheeled up to the porch. Same soft smile, same unshakable grace. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, I think about living here. Finally." She laughed, low and content. "Then we both won." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain-soaked earth through the street. Somewhere down the road, a kid shouted goodnight to a friend. The sound was small, but it carried, pure and ordinary, a sound that hadn't existed here for far too long. I leaned back, letting the last of the daylight fade. Injustice, fear, revenge, all of it had burned itself out. What remained was balance, not perfect, not permanent, but real. When people talk about justice, they imagine the hammer falling, the villain punished. But that's only half the story. The other half is this: a quiet neighborhood, a garden in bloom, a woman finally free to roll wherever she pleases. No banners, no speeches, just life, moving forward. As the porch light flickered on, I whispered the words I'd carried since that first day on the street. No more no-wheel zones. And this time it wasn't defiance, it was peaceful,